What's up, guys? In this video, Jordan Peterson is in rare form. He talks about the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of thought. Make sure to stick to the end to watch how he ties it all together.
Pain is more real than anything else. What's even more real than pain is whatever we have to fight off the pain. And that's free speech. It's identical with freedom of thought. It's associated with this capacity and necessity to listen deeply. They're flip sides of the same coin, to use a terrible cliche. Such a remarkable place, for a Canadian in particular, with our rather, what would you say, paucity of history. It's really something to come here and see a place that's so saturated with, I would say, beauty and integrity. I hope you know what you have and that you take careful care of it, because it certainly deserves it. I'm going to speak tonight as a clinician, I would say, about free speech. Dr. Orr gave a bit of an account of the battle behind the scenes, so to speak, that took place so that I could come here and talk, and that's much appreciated. A lot of people put a lot on the line to make this possible. But I find the debate itself somewhat of a mystery. I can't really understand why it's raging precisely the way it is raging. And I would say that specifically from a clinical perspective. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a clinician named Carl Rogers, and I learned something. I've studied the people I regard as the great clinicians in some detail and learned a lot from all of them, regardless of their particular school of psychotherapeutic endeavor, let's say, or their historical background or their genre. I would say the most stellar piece of advice that I ever encountered that was actually both, I would say, profound in some sense, but also immediately practical, came from Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers did an awful lot of clinical research into clinical efficacy, as well as being a rather admirable theorist. Now, his background is somewhat germane. He was really an evangelical Protestant up until the time he became a young man. He was going to go to China as a missionary and stopped because of his developing agnosticism, and then I would say atheism, as a consequence of his inability to reconcile the distinction between science and religion. But his clinical thinking is saturated with Judeo-Christian suppositions. But Rogers was also extraordinarily careful, I would say, to elaborate beyond the word to the act of the exchange of words, let's say, because for anyone to speak, in some sense, you need a listener. And what that means is that if you're going to be a participant in a good conversation, or we might even say a therapeutic conversation, that not only do you have to be an active speaker, but you have to be, to use a terribly cliched phrase, an active listener. So Rogers said that he had noted in his interactions with people in the clinical domain that it was very difficult for people to listen, and that most people had never really been listened to at all, or that many had never been listened to at all, never really attended to properly, let's say, by their parents during their course of development, never had a mentor or a teacher who really attended to them and listened. And Rogers also noted that you listening may be thinking that that's not true of you. Let's say as a person you had people who guided you, or as a listener you're perfectly good at it. And he would say, no, probably not. So Rogers said, it was an axiom of his theoretical stance, let's say, and derived it in no small part from the Freudian revelations. I mean, basically what Freud did in his clinical practice was have people come into his office, his clinic, lay down on a couch with him not visible, and talk. And the instruction was, say anything that comes to mind, anything and everything that comes to mind. So completely untrammeled, revelatory thought. Now, Freud's observation was that if you let people do that and maintain an active listening environment, even though you were hidden, he didn't want you to be dissuaded or persuaded in your utterances by any reflection of emotion on his face. That you would just have the opportunity to wander haphazardly through your field of thought. And what Freud came to realize was that the haphazard nature of that tended to transform rather quickly into something that was much more coherent and much less contaminated with excess emotion. And so that if you just let the revelatory process of free speech occur, that in itself was therapeutic.
That's a very interesting concept, because it's very similar to journaling, meditation, anything that allows you to just observe your thoughts without emotionally attaching yourself to it.
There are forms of thought that are imagistic, let's say, but certainly much of what goes on in the theaters of our imagination that constitutes thought is in the form of speech. You could say, well, we think with speech, and thought is in many ways internalized speech. And so the notion that allowing yourself to notice what you actually think about things by talking about them might be good for you if thought is in some important sense linked to, well, your bodily incarnation, let's say. And if it's not, well then what good is it? The prefrontal cortex grew out of the motor cortex in the course of evolutionary history. And so what happens in the theater of thought is that potential actions and perceptions are tried out for potential utility, so they're revealed in a sense, and then potentially criticized out of existence before you implement them stupidly in behavior and die. And I believe it was Alfred North Whitehead said, the purpose of thought is to let our thoughts die instead of us, which is correct, right? It's correct, but...
That's a powerful quote. The purpose of thought is to let our thoughts die instead of us.
Biologically, it's correct. Technically, it's correct. Philosophically, and it's worth thinking about. So, well, Freud let people reveal themselves to themselves. Now, later investigations, particularly by James Pennebaker, showed that the Freudian transformation, insofar as it did occur, say in relationship to trauma, was not a consequence of emotional catharsis, which was part of Freud's essential hypothesis, although he was more sophisticated than that, but actually a consequence of the cognitive reconstruction and reappraisal that occurred attendant upon speech related, let's say, to trauma, to revelatory speech related to trauma. And one of the things I did notice consistently in my clinical practice was that if I really, really listened to the person, they were unbelievably interesting. And so I would say, this is rather corrosive bit of self-reflection, but if you're bored in a conversation, you're the boring person, right? Because you're not listening. Because if you were listening, that person is a strange creature, man. And if they told you what they're actually up to, first of all, it'd be a shock to them, that's for sure. But if they were telling you, you would not be bored. And so there's a high probability that you're sitting there thinking what you already know about this person, what you're assuming by the way they're dressed, or the way they comport themselves, or their class, or their social status, or their ethnicity, or whatever the hell it is, stereotypes that you're using as a replacement for the genuine dialogue. And then you're also sitting there thinking about what you're going to say next when they're talking so that you can impress them, and so on and so forth. And you're not doing the kind of listening that Rogers suggested at all, because you're treating the other person as an end to an a priori defined instrumental means. And that's a big mistake. And so Rogers thought you could check yourself. And here's the experiment. And this works in a lovely manner. And actually, Rogers' work has been used in conflict management, sociology, and management at fairly high levels of governmental intervention, especially in times of war, because it actually does make peace. So Rogers suggested this technique, which I said I would get to the technique. He said, the next time you find yourself embroiled in an argument with someone that's contentious and uncomfortable, say, institute the following rule. You don't get to respond to the person's claims until they've exhausted that particular claim, and this does presume to some degree that you're dealing with a good faith actor, even if they feel differently than you do. You don't get to respond until you have recapitulated their viewpoint and summarized it in a manner they find acceptable. That's so treacherously sneaky, that rule. Because
Essentially what it's saying is to arrive at an agreement on a base set of facts. That's a very good rule. You always want to arrive at a base set of facts that you both agree on. When you have two people with different versions of reality interfacing with each other, there's always going to be a disconnect. So it's a very important insight. It's often the case people are debating and they don't even agree on the same versions of reality. They're not even in the same universe.
Treacherously sneaky, that rule. Because what it means is you have to demonstrate that you attended to what they say closely enough and carefully enough to, first of all, act out validation of the idea that they have an opinion worth attending to. So that's a big deal. Eh? People really like being paid attention to. There's nothing people like more than that. You know, I mean, when there's tension in a household and multiple, what would you say, systems of value operating simultaneously, there's a tremendous confusion about what should reign supreme, right? And you think, well, nothing has to reign supreme. We can all have our diverse opinions. No, you can't. Not if you're going to live together in harmony. There has to be some overarching structure that unites you. What else is a family if it's not an overarching structure that unites you? And as far as Rogers was concerned, well, you had to let people talk to find out what they thought, so they could find out what they thought, so they could move towards something, so they could move away from hell, because that's certainly what you see in clinical practice. I mean, people are suffering in ways you can hardly, well, you can probably imagine, because no doubt many of you have either been there or seen people who were there, lived with them. You know, to move away from that's more real than anything else. If pain is more real than anything else, what's even more real than pain is whatever we have to fight off the pain. And that's free speech. It's identical with freedom of thought. It's associated with this capacity and necessity to listen deeply. They're flip sides of the same coin, to use a terrible cliche. And all the clinical data we have, including the more stringently research-oriented clinical inquiry, indicates quite clearly that the exchange of information like that, the generation of semantic and emotional information in a state of relative freedom, the revelation of those thoughts, and then the discursive analysis of those thoughts, say, and then the implementation into action and the testing of them, that is the pathway to health, insofar as that can be attained by, say, psychological or spiritual means. And so that's why free speech is not just another freedom or right among many. It's certainly not viewpoint diversity or anything like that. It's the mechanism by which we generate the conceptions that allow us to organize our experience in the world. It's that mechanism. And more than that, it's the mechanism that allows us to reformulate and criticize those conceptions when they've become outdated and sterile, to dissolve them into a chaos that we have to contend with while it's occurring, and then to reanimate them in a new form so that we can move into the future. And so if you're concerned with the oppressed, let's say, why in the world would you oppose free speech? It's the only thing the oppressed have.
That's exactly it. It makes absolutely no sense why some of the people who are claiming to be the most oppressed are also the most against freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, it's such an important tool. Like it's one of the more effective tools in your toolkit against tyrants, oppressors. You get the opportunity to speak out publicly and without harm about what is oppressing you. If you're against free speech, you're inclined towards being tyrannical. You're inclined towards being someone who oppresses someone. Because that's one of the main reasons why you'd want to control speech, is because you don't want people saying things that you disagree with. That makes you a tyrant. And it reveals that you have a low faith in humanity, because you think that just people simply hearing bad ideas is enough to make them become bad. Or it could also be that you're projecting and you know that you have that tendency to be influenced by bad ideas, and you think everyone else does. Because you lack the capacity for critical thought, you think others do as well. Either way, it's not good. Generally speaking, if you oppose freedom of speech, you're aligned with tyrants, historically. You're not in good company, because your reasoning for doing that is likely because you want to control people, not because you want to help people. You want to control them, you have low faith in them, and you know that you probably have some inclination or tendency for that same behavior. What's fascinating is some of these people claiming to be oppressed have revealed how much power they have, as evidenced by their ability to censor everyone.
And if you don't understand that, I would say, well, that's either an ignorance that's so deep that you should remediate it as rapidly as possible, or a malevolence that's so appalling that you should face it even though you'll face it at your peril. And so you come to a university like this that's been a bastion of free speech, in a country that's been a bastion of free speech, and a light unto the world in that regard for 1,000 years, and all due credit to all of you for that. It's like, don't forget this. This is the fundamental thing. Say, the entire Judeo-Christian enterprise to this date has been an attempt, in some sense, to elevate to the highest place the notion of the divine redemptive word. And there's no truth that's deeper than that, and that's that. So, thank you very much.
Anyways, that's the video. Let me know what you guys think. If you agree with what Jordan Peterson is saying and what I'm saying, then you're on the good side. If you disagree, please explain in the comments below why you think it'd be productive as a society to continue to limit freedom of speech, because I'm confused.